Hello and welcome to everybody who's joining our Plant Life Spring into Action webinar series today. Thank you very much for joining us. We're just going to allow a few seconds for everybody else to join us this morning. My name's Alistair Morley. I'm Head of Important Plant Areas and Advice for Plant Life, and I'm just going to introduce the webinar this morning. Before I do that, just give you a little bit of housekeeping, just to let everybody know that the session will be recorded and it will be available on YouTube in the next few days, next week or two, and we can provide a link to that for anybody who's not able to see the full thing or wants to revisit it. For anybody who's got any problems, then technical problems or anything like that, Becky James, who's one of our Plant Life colleagues, is there in the background. If you can put any problems or questions you've got in the chat function at the bottom, then Becky will try and sort those for you if there's anything at all. The webinar is going to last about an hour or so, up to about 12 o'clock. We're hoping that we'll have 10 minutes or so at the end for any questions, or as many questions as we can possibly manage. If you can put your questions in the Q&A section on the bottom of your screen, that would be very useful. I will collate those and I'll ask our speakers as many of those as we can manage at the end, and we will answer as many as we can, but obviously we quite possibly won't be able to get round to absolutely everybody. So I think that's it. As we go on, we'll be putting some links for other information into the Q&A as well, so there will be more information there. I just now really want to introduce the two speakers. So Dave Lammercraft, who at Plant Life, he's our lower plant champion. Dave's based up in North Wales, but has worked right across the UK, Scotland, Wales, England, North, South, East and West. Huge experience, and he's going to be our main speaker today. And we've also got very welcome and pleased to have Demelza Hyde from the National Trust from Lidford Gorge, who's going to give us a little bit of an insight into the work that she's been doing in terms of ash dieback. So really, without much more ado, I'm going to hand you over to Dave, who's fundamentally going to tell us why ash dieback is a problem, particularly for temperate rainforest lichens, and as important as that, what we can do about it. So thanks very much, Dave. Over to you.
Thanks, Al, and hi everyone. So yeah, I'm going to talk about essentially give you a bit of background really on why ash dieback is such a problem for lichens, and then importantly what we can do about it. So to start with, just do a bit of background. So what lichens grow where? They're not kind of like, they don't just grow randomly around the country. They're very particular to certain conditions, and some of the key things that determine what grows where are the climate and the microclimate, especially things like light and temperature and humidity. So you'll get different species growing in the rainforest in the west of Britain than you do in the east in the dry grasses of the Brecks, for example. Then what they grow on is really important. They're really fussy about what they grow on, and this is around the chemistry of the tree bark or the rock or the soil, along with the texture and the porosity, so kind of things that determine how much water the bark might hold or the rock might hold. And then kind of broader environmental things like nutrients especially, so you'll get naturally occurring nutrients like bird droppings in seabird colonies. So you get particular communities of lichens that are associated with these kind of naturally occurring nutrient-rich environments. There's also the kind of artificial nutrient-rich environments around sort of manure and that kind of thing. Things like salinity, salt spray especially, you get whole communities of lichens growing on the seashores because they're adapted to cope with that high level of salinity. And then air pollution has had a major impact on what lichens grow where across the British Isles since the Industrial Revolution. So sulfur dioxide in particular, and more latterly nitrogen, ammonia and nitrogen oxide. So basically lichens have very particular requirements. The more specialist species, the rarer species, have really particular requirements. They're really fussy, and this is often around pH and nutrients. So an intolerance of nutrients basically. So ammonia, for example, ammonia pollution is toxic to some lichen species. So that's a bit of background, which hopefully gives a bit of context around the ash dieback issue. The other important bit of context is around elm trees and Dutch elm disease. So that picture top left there looks like it's from my kind of childhood, and I'm just about a little bit too young to really have appreciated the massive loss of elm trees through the 1970s. I was aware it was going on, but didn't really get what the issue was. So obviously a really common tree, English elm and wych elm across Britain, but pretty much wiped out or close to being wiped out from large areas by Dutch elm disease through the 70s and 80s in particular. And elm trees had, still have, where they survive, some really specialist lichen species, really specialist to elm trees, such as the orange-fruited elm lichen at the top right there. So the orange-fruited elm lichen is probably the classic elm species. The really particular requirements, obviously really liked the elm bark, quite sensitive to pollution, but really kind of likes that chemistry and the moisture retentive properties of the elm trees. The map on the right here is data from the British Lichen Society from Britain and Ireland, and it's 10 kilometre squares, grid squares. The pale green are records up to 1959, the blue are records from 1960 through to 99, and the red dots, red squares, are post-2000 records. So that really shows how widespread it used to be. Now, the decline was kind of underway, probably partly as a result of the first earlier episodes of Dutch elm disease, but also it's taken a hit from air pollution. So that decline was probably underway up to the 1970s, but it really got going in the 70s and 80s through the loss of elm to Dutch elm disease. And now it's an incredibly rare lichen. And it's a similar story with eagle's claws lichen. So again, you can see the map on the right there, a massive contraction in its range. This is also really sensitive to air pollution. So air pollution has played into that decline as well. But again, the loss of elms has been a major factor in the decline of that species. And the sapgroove lichen, again, a similar story, but less extreme. So this species, although it used to really love elm and really loves ash, it will also grow on field maple and holly and beech and oak as well. So it's got a broader kind of range, and this really likes sap runs and wound tracks on trees. So you find it below damaged bits of the tree. And the fragrant jelly lichen often grows with the sapgroove lichen in the same niche, but it's a magnitude rarer. Always has been, but again, really hit by the loss of elms. And then the elm dialecta, so the clues in the name there, used to be, well, it's always quite rare in Britain, but it was an elm tree specialist. It's now pretty much gone from elm trees, and it's mostly found on limestone, on rock. And that's, again, relates back to that chemistry and porosity type of thing. So with elm trees having bark up around pH 7, it's not really being able to switch onto other trees, not even ash. So it's only now found on limestone. This is an unassuming little wych elm up in the Lake District. This photo was taken just a couple of years ago. It's right next to a really busy footpath next to Ullswater. It's pretty much hollow, that trunk. It's used as a wee stop by walkers. Yet this little tree is one of the most important trees for lichens in Britain, and gives you a little taste of perhaps what it used to be like when elms were much commoner. So this tree has the orange-fruited elm lichen, it has the sapgroove lichen, and the fragrant jelly lichen, all growing on the inside of the trunk there on the bare wood. It also has some of the labarion lichens, the lungwort community lichens growing on it, and other really rare species that are specialists on ash as well as elm, like Ramonia nigra. So a really important tree, this, and just a kind of a window into the history of elm tree lichens in Britain. So why is or was elm so important for these lichens? Well, I mentioned it just now. A lot of it's around the bark. Well, it's essentially about the bark, and it's to do with the pH of the bark. It's got very alkaline bark, up around pH 7. The bark is rough textured and water retentive. It's a big tree, it's long lived, and it was widespread. So there's a lot of them about, and it has this tendency to acquire wounds, and you get these kind of interesting little niches for specialist species like the sap groove lichen, where the tree might lose a limb, and you get a sort of nutrient run down the trunk. Okay, so just to recap on that a little bit. So we know lichens have these really particular needs. They get everything they need from the environment around them. They're not taking any nutrients or sustenance from the tree. They're very dependent on rain and a lack of air pollution, basically. Elm trees still are, but really were incredibly important for a whole range of specialist lichens, and that's largely about their bark characters. And as you've seen, these species have all declined significantly since the loss of elms to Dutch elm disease. Okay, so moving on to ash. So ash, I mean, to me, it's probably my favourite tree, actually, although that elm at Ullswater is a bit of a favourite. But ash, just such a significant tree in British woodlands and across the British landscape. It's a real key tree in the rainforest zones in the west of Britain. This photo here is from the west of Scotland, and you can see the kind of shaggy appearance of all the branches on the tree there. That's because they're all draped in tree lungwort lichen, Lobelia pulmonaria. So it's an incredibly important tree for lichens. A couple of maps here. So again, these are 10-kilometre grid squares, and the map on the left, the darker the red colour, the more species there are on ash trees in those squares. You can see there's a lot of orange, red and dark red. So the dark red colour, you've got between 46 and 155 different species growing on ash trees within that 10-kilometre square. So it gives you just a kind of picture really of how important ash is across Britain, although I'm not quite sure why Northern Ireland's missing from that map. And the map on the right, so this is a subset of the map on the left. So this is just the really threatened species, those that are critically endangered and endangered, vulnerable or near threatened on the British Red List, and those species for which Britain has an international responsibility for their global conservation. So we have internationally significant proportions of their populations. And you can see again, within that distribution on the left, a lot of that area has really threatened rare species. And this includes, importantly, many former elm specialist species. So why is ash so important for lichens? Well, similar to the elm, really, it's a big tree, common and long-lived, so it's a significant tree across the British landscape. The bark has a relatively high pH, rarely as high as elm, and it can be quite acidic, but it's generally around sort of 5, 6. And it has similar characteristics in the bark and its kind of texture and its moisture retentive properties. And it also has this kind of poor resistance to fungal damage, so it provides niches for specialist species like the sap groove lichen and similar. So, the estimates were around 80% loss of ash across Britain. So what are the implications of that loss of ash for lichens? Well, I think perhaps, I was going to say most significant, it's probably not most significant, but it's pretty much, it's up there. So it became the next best tree for a lot of these former elm specialists. So these elm specialist species were already under the cosh from the loss of elm, and now they're coming under another cosh for the loss of ash. Ash is also really important for a whole range of other threatened species and communities. So the base-rich bark woodland community, the lungwort lichen community in particular. Many of these species have really particular requirements that are provided by things like the chemistry of the bark and the moisture retentive properties and what have you. Then less direct, we have just the impact on the loss of a major woodland canopy tree in our woodlands. So the way that would impact on things like humidity and the microclimates within our rainforest, for example. So overall, the impact is likely to be incredibly significant. Okay, so what can we do about it? This is the important bit, I think. So we've been funded by both Natural England and Natural Resources Wales to undertake some work in the past few years, undertaking the review of kind of like the threat to various species of ash dieback, and also to start looking into ways in which people can manage sites to mitigate the impact of the loss of ash on these lichens. As I said, we undertook well, it became a pretty hefty document, this big review document that we undertook for Natural England, but we've distilled that into some guidance for site managers, which we've just published for England on the website. And Becky will be putting some links into the chat later on where you can access this guidance. The Welsh one is just going through translation at the moment, and that will be available fairly soon, hopefully. Again, in the same place as this. So the link will work. And this kind of looked at which species were most at threat. So we have things like the intricate speckled belly lichen at the top left there, which is found in the ashwood up in Cumbria. The fringed shield lichen, top right. The fragrant jelly lichen, bottom right, which you've met already. And the shy cross your heart lichen to the bottom left there. And as I've mentioned a couple of times, also this community of lichens that like space-rich bark in the woodlands. So this is one of our key rainforest communities, the Labarion community, base-rich bark, and also base-rich rock in sheltered, well-lit sites. So the UK is internationally important for many of the species that form this community. And this community has already been declining or is threatened in much of Great Britain by habitat loss and fragmentation, also declining habitat quality, whether that's invasive species like rhododendron or changes in grazing levels, and by air pollution. So ash dieback adds another threat on top of these threats that are already there. And we looked at, you start thinking about, okay, how do you kind of start to work out what the risk is on different sites? And we came up with this kind of this sort of risk level idea. And so a site with no ash or very little ash is going to be of limited risk. So you probably don't need to worry too much about things. You can carry on managing the site well for lichens and bryophytes, or for whatever other interest you might have there. But as soon as you get ash as a significant component of your woodland, even if there are other tree species present and there's lichen interest on that ash, but alongside other tree species, then your risk is slightly higher, but it's still relatively low because you've got a whole load of other tree species present and your lichen interest is spread across oak as well as ash. So not quite such a high risk, but you can still do things to mitigate the impact of the loss of ash. So continue to manage the site to promote the general lichen interest, and then follow a set of simple steps, which I'll come on to shortly. As soon as you're into sites where ash is either more prevalent or where it's much more important for the lichen interest, you're into much higher levels of risk, and you start to need to think about other considerations around kind of plugging the gap of the loss that the loss of ash will create. And obviously, if you're talking about an ashwood that's 90% ash, then that needs a lot more thought, and the risk is incredibly high. So in terms of the, sorry about the text heavy slide here, it's just it's one of the pages from the guidance document. I won't spend too long going through this, but as a kind of starting point, then ensuring that the management of a site is along the right lines for what the lichens need in general, will basically give the lichens a much better chance of adapting to the changes that are going to come about through the loss of ash. So it's about getting your site in as good a condition as possible to start with. Retaining ash trees as long as you can, so leaving infected trees to die naturally where appropriate. So that's important both for the lichens, but also in terms of any evolving tolerance to ash dieback. Obviously, there'll be health and safety considerations, and in those cases, we'd advise thinking about ways in which you can leave as much of the trunk standing as you can. I'll go on to talk about this again shortly. Leaving dead wood in situ is a good thing, but please don't stack it against the tree because that can damage the tree and also any lichens that are on it. And an approach that some sites have taken, so Horner Wood National Trust down in Somerset, they've rerouted a load of footpaths to avoid important ash trees to get people away from the health and safety risks. So taking that approach to managing health and safety. And when it comes to these higher risk scenarios where you've got a lot of ash or you've got a lot of species that are important on ash, and it's really around thinking about what other possible habitats, alternative host trees and rocks you have around and managing around those to create the right conditions. So tree planting will always be a medium to long-term solution. And a big problem is going to be the short term, what we do in the short term. And there are, so we need to work with what we've got on the site already to start thinking about the short term before we start thinking more long-term planning for that kind of plugging in the gap in the canopy and all that kind of stuff through tree planting. Tree planting, if you've got a wood that's 90% ash, then you're going to have to start thinking about tree planting ASAP as well. But you can think about what kind of species you plant to make sure you plant rapidly maturing species like hazel and sallow, as well as the longer term canopy forming species like oak. So in terms of the right conditions, a lot of this is around managing light levels, not just in the woodland, but also in parkland scenarios too. And generally the best long-term way to do this is through managing grazing levels. That's not always possible, obviously. You can do it with thinning works and glade creation, that kind of thing. But generally speaking, getting your grazing right so you have pulses of regeneration, but generally maintain open, well-lit conditions. That's this photo basically demonstrates the kind of conditions that are ideal for our woodland lichens. Note the high proportion of ash in this photo. So this illustrates the issue quite well, really. It's a fence dividing two parts of what was the same site. On the left, you've got a lot of ivy, holly coming in, bramble. A lot of the trees are covered in ivy. The woodland floor is covered in ivy. Generally not a very good site for bryophytes, mosses, liverworts or lichens anymore. In contrast to the area to the right of the fence, which still maintains all that interest. Now, arguably the grazing might be too heavy on the right, and the ideal is probably somewhere in the middle. And maybe if the fence hadn't gone up and it just adjusted the grazing, that might have been a better approach, but in danger of getting onto another subject there. Managing threats such as rhododendron, so having rhododendron as well as ash dieback just doubles the threats that the lichens having to deal with. So just keeping on top of these other sort of site-based issues that are going to impact on the lichens. Ivy similarly has a big impact. The trees at the bottom left have a good population of the eagle's claw lichen, this down in Dorset. Same site, top left, the tree would be suitable for the eagle's claw, but it's covered in ivy, so it's not. The tree on the right used to have tree lungwort lichen in 2001. This photo was taken in 2016 and the lichen is gone due to that growth of ivy over it. Now, obviously ivy is quite an important resource for invertebrates, bats, the whole over the biodiversity. We tend not to advocate controlling that mature crown ivy like top left. The damage is already done basically with that one. But a tree like the one on the right definitely would be the sort of thing that we'd advocate controlling the ivy on. It's where it starts to invade, basically. It's worth keeping on top of. And as I've mentioned earlier, rocks can be really important, especially in woodland settings. This rock outcrop on the left here is just below Snowdon up in North Wales. And this is a very much ash dominated block of woodland. The rock has supports a really good population of the frilly fruited jelly skin lichen, which is to the right there. I'm not making these names up. And that's partly because of acid rain. So the ash trees in this valley basically look like they've been acid washed. They're completely stripped clean of lichens, but the rocks, the base rich rocks, provide a refuge for the lichens. But they're very vulnerable to overgrowth by brambles, especially, and the kind of bigger, more competitive mosses. So it's really important to keep the rocks in an open condition as well. Okay, so in terms of keeping as much of the tree standing as you can, let's turn the sound off. So this is down in Hornerwood National Trust down in Somerset. It's a big ash next to a road, you can see there, and also next to a very popular sort of picnic area to the left. So there was a health and safety need to manage this tree. And rather than felling at the base, because they had good access with the road, they're able to just take the top off of that tree, which, if there are rare lichens growing on it, at least that tree is there standing for as long as it survives, allowing the lichens to do their thing. At least they're reproducing, and they're able to spread. A good example of the need to control some ivy on that tree, though. So you'll see there's lots of guidance out there on managing for ash dieback, and lots of talk about replacement trees. What's really missing is this really detailed stuff about lichens. And when it comes to alternative trees, so this formed a big part of the report work that we did for Natural England. And it turned out that I was quite surprised by this, that oak is actually one of the best replacement trees for ash in Britain. It's an interesting tree, and it starts off quite acidic, but it becomes more base rich as it ages. There's also some evidence that suggests it's becoming more base rich at an earlier age now that we're having less acid rain, which is all a good sign. So it's a common tree as well. So that kind of gives us a bit of hope, really. It's a really good tree for the lungwort lichen community. Then I've already mentioned hazel and willow. So hazel and willow give us this really important short-term potential solution, partial solution for the problem. The key thing with hazel and willow really is that they're not too shaded. So when they're a sort of scatter component of the understory, they're less good for the lungwort lichens. You can see the picture top right there, there's lungwort lichen over that willow stall. So they tend to be better in better lit conditions. So in the southwest, hazel often comes into old meadows that were formerly kept open within the wooded river valleys, and those kind of open stands of hazel can be really important. It can also be a problem like the bottom left there. So that's that hazel has basically produced loads of sun shoots in response to a reduction in grazing pressure, and that situation just shades out the bigger stems that are the important ones for the Liberian lichen, the lungwort lichen community. That one on the top right there is probably ideal. It's got sun shoots, so they're little skinny shoots, but it's also got, well, it's got quite a range of ages of shoots on that one stall. So that's a good sign that the grazing's about right. And again, willow. So this willow and hazel, they can become colonized by these lichens really quite quickly. This is down at Arlington Court, top left and top right, down in Devon. And the willows are good for these lichens when they're this sort of bushy form, but also when they're tree form, like bottom right, which is up in North Wales. Then when we're looking at more sort of bigger canopy forming trees, sycamore is really important, especially for the lungwort community again, but also for some of the former elm specialist species like the sapgroove lichen and the orange-fruited elm lichen. So the tree in the middle is in Cornwall. That has a good population of the sapgroove lichen growing below the broken trunk. The tree on the left, really rich lungwort lichen community up in North Wales. The picture on the right is the same tree. It does have its problems in that the bark gets really flaky with sycamore, so you might get a whole lump of lichens will just fall off with a bark flake. So it's not without its issues. Also needs managing within a woodland situation because it can take over the understory, but grazing usually keeps on top of that. And when it comes to other species, things like aspen here on the left and other popular species have good potential. Again, their bark chemistry is quite high pH, as with Norway maple, top right. So Norway maple can be a really, really good lichen tree. Obviously not native. And then wych elm we've talked about already. So we do, I don't think I mentioned it earlier, but we do have the option for some species at least to try transplanting them. And this is an ash tree that blew down in the summer gale a couple of years ago up in North Wales. And we took the opportunity to move some of that material down into a lower part of the wood, so onto sycamore. So we're specifically getting it onto species other than ash, sycamore and oak in particular. And this is also in part of the wood that had a really heavy infestation of rhododendron in the late 90s that had impacted on the lichens. So it was an opportunity both to save some lichens, to get them onto trees other than ash, and also to restore populations in the area where they've been lost due to rhododendron. Now, identifying your interest is really crucial to a lot of what I'm talking about, and that can be quite hard. We do have a number of tools that you could use to look at that though. So we have this tool called the Rapid Woodland Assessment, which we developed as a means for site managers to assess the potential value of their wood for lichens and bryophytes too, and look at some of the issues. That's also been used by volunteers to go surveying woods just around a wider kind of area. So not just been used by kind of site managers. We produced a load of identification guides aimed at the beginner, aimed at that kind of entry level to help you identify some of the key species. You might be lucky enough to have survey reports. Survey reports will detail the interest, but they'll also give you indications as to what some of the management issues might be. And more latterly, most survey reports will deal with ash dieback specifically. Yeah, and on the subject of reports, you might be in a position to commission them, in which case you can specify that the surveyor will look at ash dieback. And the NBN Atlas provides you a whole load of information. The British Lichen Society and the British Biological Society both upload their data to the NBN regularly, so it's an amazing source of information. And this is really useful in honing in on the important areas on the site. So this is Horner Wood in Somerset. We were funded by Natural England to undertake this piece of work to look at how they might manage to mitigate the impacts of ash dieback on the site. And using the data from various reports, I basically prioritized the species according to the proportion of the population that were on ash trees at Horner. So priority 1 only on ash trees, and it's interesting there are only a couple of species, 4 species that were only on ash in the whole of the site. So most species are on other species of tree too, like hazel and oak. So priority 2 is where there are about half, 2/3 of the population on ash, and then priority 3 where less than 50% of the populations were on ash. So this really, they manage all the woodland you can see on that map is pretty much managed by National Trust. And on the face of it, you might think, oh, blimey, ash dieback, lichens, we need to kind of manage the whole wood. But actually, the interest is really localized into these sort of river, right down in the bottom of the valley along the river. And you can see they're real hot spots. So you can start to form and focus your kind of management solutions. It made the job seem less daunting, I think. So that kind of demonstrates, I think, how that kind of data is really important. I think, yeah, okay, so enough of me now. I'm going to hand over to Melza. So it's been great working with Demelza on this work, and Demelza is going to tell you all about putting this theory into practice. Okay, I'll shut up.
Thanks, Dave. Well, today I was going to talk to you about lichens at Lidford and how ash dieback has started to affect our site, and putting into practice the theory kind of that Dave's talked about, and also what I've learned over the last year. So yeah, it all started from something that we found that was special on the site to changing our management practices for the future. Next slide, please, Dave. So just to give you a bit of background, Lidford Gorge is a site of special scientific interest on Dartmoor. We're right on the edges of Dartmoor. We have over 80,000 visitors a year, and it is an amazing visitor attraction that people come miles to come and see. The site itself is mainly a semi-natural ancient woodland, but more importantly, we now know that it's actually a temperate rainforest. The site has a number of important features for geology, geomorphological interests such as river capture and gorge formation, and also is a good example of ancient oak hazel woodland. But the site is extremely steep. We have very little vehicle access, so it presents sort of many challenges really. But now we also realise that the site is important for its lichens and its biophytes. Although this was briefly mentioned in the SSI citation, actually there was a lack of understanding about the importance of these, and this has only really come to light recently. The site itself is about 120 acres. It's long and linear. It has a number of permissive paths, and it's what we call a pay to enter site. So the National Trust charge during the spring and summer, and the whole of the site is open. Whereas in the winter, we actually only keep open one area of the woodland whilst we carry out our woodland management and maintenance work in the rest of the gorge. So a lot of our visitors come to see the 30-metre high waterfall, and also the Devil's Cauldron at the other end, which is a series of ancient potholes created by the River Lid. And the River Lid actually runs all the way through the gorge itself and creates a very mild and humid climate, which means that the forest floor and the trees are just absolutely adorned with biophytes and lichens. I'll have the next slide, please. So it all started a few years ago with tree lungworts. So I come from a place of knowing nothing about lichens until just recently. Now I know a little tiny bit, thanks to Plant Life and Dave. So during the winter of 2019-20, we had a few ash trees to fell in one localised area as part of our tree safety management works. And these were trees that were identified to be a health and safety risk to visitors, so we had to take them out. And when I felled one of the trees, I found something on there that I recognised, and I thought, I've seen this on Countryfile and them talking about it. And it was indeed a clump of tree lungwort, or what I thought was tree lungwort, or Lobelia pulmonaria. So I took some photos, sent that off to our ecologists within the National Trust, and they confirmed that that is exactly what we had. So then later on in February 2020, we were contacted by Plant Life volunteer, and a rapid woodland assessment that Dave has mentioned was carried out on the site, which I tagged along to. And we found actually that we had tree lungwort in a lot more places, and also some of the other lichens and biophytes that are part of that assessment. So the interest started to grow, my passion for it started to be ignited, and at this time we also had a lot of interest from some members from the British Lichen Society, and we started facing some challenge around why we had felled some of our ash trees in the area we started with, and you know, that was we aware that we actually had some important lichens on the site and we should be trying to mitigate the impacts of that. So really, that challenge meant that we started to have a bit more detailed look. And then in March 2020, members of the British Lichen Society came out and surveyed this small area and found lots of lichens, but also found some important lichens. And so it meant that we really needed to start thinking about what we was doing and the impact of ash dieback from that perspective. I'll have the next slide, please. So because we have a high number of visitors to the sites, people pay to come to the site, we don't have any public footpaths, we have a responsibility for their safety. So each year in the summer months, so particularly June, July, we survey our ash trees because that's the best time to identify whether they have got ash dieback and to what effect it is affecting the canopy. And we also survey our other trees on the site in the autumn months, and how often they're surveyed depends on the amount of people that stay within that area or near those trees and the associated risks with that. So that creates a list of trees that we need to either fell or to carry out safety work. So things like crown reduction or monolithing, which Dave talked about. And last summer, we actually went from having about 60 trees the previous year to having at least 320 to fell, that we identified, that if not more than that. And so a few years ago, we only had a couple of trees to then go into 320. Last year was our worst year for ash dieback, and our estimates are that this is going to continue for another couple of years. So during the previous winter, last winter, when we felled these 60 ash trees, I was finding more and more of these lichens, the tree lungwort particularly on those felled trees, and also lots of lichens that I couldn't identify. I just knew it was a lichen. So this basically drove me to kind of needing to find out more, learn how to identify at least the lichen communities, and have an awareness of kind of how to identify them and what we can do and how we can protect them or try to mitigate the potential loss from ash dieback going forward. So with the help of Plant Life, I learned a little bit about lichens. I've learned something about temperate rainforests and their management, and I decided we needed to act and try to actually get this sorted. The problem is, as Dave mentioned, you need to know your data and know your site. We had little or no data on the lichens, except for a very few vague records. So without that data, it's difficult to work out what species of lichens we had present, where they were in the gorge, what population we had, more importantly, what tree species they were growing on, and thus the potential impact of ash dieback and our felling operations. So this is where I needed some extra help. I needed some specialist help, and I needed to get some more data. So Dave has already mentioned that there's a range of resources that have been produced by Plant Life. There's their videos that you can find on YouTube. There's the PDF that Dave mentioned, and I did the temperate rainforest training. It all helped me to frame some ideas for the site. But I asked Dave for some extra advice because I was conscious that maybe we had something that was important and we needed to be aware of. So Dave suggested that I carry out a very basic survey, particularly focused on the areas of the gorge where we were completing our felling works this winter now. And he asked me to focus on the Liberian lichens, and the ones on the screen on the slide are the ones that he asked me to look out for. And he gave me some details about how to identify them, and I also used some guides and some ID books. I also luckily had help from a lichenologist for a day, so she was able to identify a lot more and start to collate that data. One of the things we found was trying to do the survey in November, we had difficult light levels, and that most of the time when you read about lichens, they're supposed to be on the lower part of the tree. Yet our lichens seem to be mainly in the canopy, which made it very difficult to see them in the poor light levels. And also we needed binoculars to do that. But having said that, we now have a much better idea of what species we have and where they are in the gorge. And as Dave mentioned, we were finding we had hotspots, particularly by the river where it was humid, and also in the areas where we had good light levels as well as that humidity. So once we had some better data, some better informations, there was various discussions with Dave, and also I organised a site meeting with our head of nature conservation from the National Trust. Dave came along, and also our National Trees and Woodlands Advisor, who deals particularly around woodland management and the safety aspects and ash dieback. And this meeting really was to discuss locally what we could do, but also nationally in the trust, kind of what we could do in terms of our approach to this and help us as rangers on the ground in terms of our woodland management. So as part of this work, we created an action plan based on this advice. We had a series of recommendations for each of the areas of importance, particularly for the Liberian community is our focus at the moment, and focused on those areas where we're due to remove the majority of our ash. What this meant is I then carried out a review of the trees to be felled, and we've reduced the total number after looking at the health and safety aspect of this specifically. So originally we were thinking about trees that were within 2 tree lengths of a path or a building or a car park, but actually that was not really the way to look at it. We looked at each tree and questioned ourselves and challenged ourselves about, was it really a risk? Was it leaning away from the path, even if it was next to the path? Were there just a couple of branches over the path that we could deal with rather than the whole tree? Or was the actual tree far enough away that only the crown of it would land on the path, and therefore, whilst it might give someone a scratch or a minor injury, the risk level actually was low in comparison to what might be lost if we felled that tree. We also looked at where we might be able to get machinery in. Now, our site is very steep. We have little vehicle access. However, there are a couple of tracks, albeit quite steep, where you could get a mobile elevated platform, so we could monolift some of the trees. This meant that actually at the moment we don't have to fell those trees. We can leave them till they're a lot further down the line with ash dieback and then deal with them at the point where they become completely unsafe. We've also agreed with Dave a method of translocating the Liberian lichens, particularly where we have to fell those trees, we have no alternative. And we have applied for a license for Natural England to be able to do that. And we're waiting for that to come through. So we've got a very simple method that we can apply. So what now? We have a very detailed list of actions. We also have some things that we can do on a wider scale. So we are reviewing and rewriting our woodland management plan based on that advice and using those documents that Dave has referenced. We have started felling the trees which are less important for lichens whilst we wait for our license for translocation. When we fell any trees, we check them before and after and save any material that we find that we can translocate. And we're leaving those felled trees in situ and leaving them in whole sections if needs be, or as large a sections as possible, whilst trying to keep the site safe and also tidy. And traditionally, woodlands were kept tidy. So actually our woodland looks to the untrained eye as a mess. However, the benefits of that far outweigh having everything stacked in neat timber piles around the site and habitat piles. If we are finding lichens on the trees, we're leaving those trees on their side so the slugs and snails don't eat them. And we have a checklist we've produced for all our staff and volunteers to use before and after felling, really, and an ID guide. And we're seeking funding to do a detailed survey going forward. And we have started to map those important areas for the Liberian community, and that's something we're going to progress. And we're starting to carry out some of the actions per area, which I'll talk to you about in a second. So the future, we are going to be looking at a formal translocation project and carrying out general monitoring where we are translocating using a basic technique around the rest of the site. We will be keeping sycamore in our woodland and favouring this in our important areas rather than removing it, which would have been our normal practice. We're controlling our beech and laurel around the saplings and ringbark in mature trees. We're trying to encourage a greater species diversity, particularly on the site we have wych elm, hazel and willow. And with that hazel, we are not going to be coppicing it, so it allows that short-term option for the lichens. And we're removing competing trees from around our oaks. We don't have a lot of mature trees because they fall over in high winds, but we are trying to improve conditions around them. And we're trying to retain our ash as long as possible. So we are closing off areas, we are limiting our access in some of the areas for staff. And where we do go in those areas, we're doing a risk assessment just to make sure it's safe. And lastly, coming from a place of no knowledge of lichens at all and a complete lack of data, in my opinion, I would suggest you really get to know your site and the lichen interest you have, the communities that you have. You don't need to know the individual lichens. If you can identify those communities, that's all that's needed. That's how I know, I've been told anyway. Identify the areas that are important for lichens and focus on reviewing your management practices in those areas. The plant life guides, there are lots of resources out there to help you. I found them really useful. You can make a start now. You don't have to wait. Think ahead and identify the key areas of ash you might have in your woodland or other trees that are important. There's other diseases out there affecting trees. And really challenge your thinking. Is that tree really a risk? Can I leave it? Can I just snap some branches off using a winch? Can I get a vehicle in there so I can deal with that at a later point? And also think about what else can I do if I do need to fell it? Can I translocate those lichens? And is there other habitat management that I can do for the future to benefit those lichens? And it would also benefit everything else that you'll find there. So really, my advice is it's never too late to start. We were late coming into this, but there's lots that you can do.
Okay, that's Demelza done, I think. Yeah. So yeah, that's amazing. Thanks, Demelza. It's been it's interesting because the guidance we produced was kind of largely theory, but working with Demelza and her colleagues at Horner Wood up in Somerset as well has really been a chance to kind of think about whether it works basically, and to kind of work through some of the issues and do some of the thinking on it. And it's been amazing that journey that Demelza's been on too. I'm really conscious of time, so I want to leave a bit of time for questions. We've got maybe 5 minutes.
Yeah, thanks ever so much, Dave and Demelza. Lots of really interesting comments. Fantastic. We've got people on this webinar from England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and the Netherlands and elsewhere as well, I suspect. It's brilliant to see so much interest. Thank you so much for that. I will try and get through as many questions as possible. There's no way we're going to get through them all, but what we will do is we will have a record of all of those questions. We'll try and respond outside the webinar to any that we don't get to. So these will be a little bit random, but Dave, one sort of theme that seems to be coming up is age. So death and age. Questions from Laura, Neem, John and Carl, which are all linked to that. Sort of composite question: is it true that generally dead trees have greater lichen coverage than live trees? Does age matter in terms of lichens? And in what way does the chemistry change as trees start to die, and what effect does that have? All in about a minute, if you can do it, Dave.
That's a challenge, right? Okay. Yeah, age is really important, but basically what happens with lichen communities is they change as the trees age. So you'll get, right from the beginning, you'll get pioneer lichen communities on twigs and on saplings. You like this ash photo here. You'll get trees at that kind of age where you get the bearing community coming on, and those are trees to nest. And certainly with oak trees, you get this whole other community coming in when the bark gets really craggy. And then when the bark starts falling off, the tree starts dying, you get the bare wood, you get another community coming onto that bare wood. So it's kind of like a succession of communities as the tree ages. And I guess the important thing, young trees can be important. Older trees tend to have the rarer things, the more things of greater conservation significance. But the important thing is the tree's allowed to kind of go through its life naturally, as much as possible. Whether some of those questions were coming from the point whether ash dieback presents opportunities in terms of the things that like dead wood or bare wood, it's not really the case that ash wood is particularly good for lichens. It tends to be when the tree starts dying, it's oak trees and acid wood that is more important for those specialist lichens that like the dead trees. So we're not going to see a massive benefit from a load of dead ash in terms of lichens.
Okay, thanks, Dave. There's another theme that was coming up with ivy, and just how you get the balance right in terms of and one example was given a site where there's a lot of big deer population, little regeneration of trees, but a lot of ivy on them, and what would the recommendation be there, and how do you get that balance right?
So that's almost as bad a question as what's the right level of grazing. Deer can do a really good job in some woods, but a really bad job in others. The right amount of ivy. So ivy is increasing, no doubt about that. Also, no doubt it's good for other biodiversity, as I mentioned. And, I think leaving the crown ivy alone, the mature stuff is kind of okay. In many cases where you have got that really mature ivy, the deer will keep a browse line, and you'll have the lower trunk of the tree can still be quite good for the lichens as long as you've got that browse line there. But if you're seeing every tree covered in ivy, then to me that's way too much. I can't quite remember the number for some reason, but I have come across a number of trees within a given area that is okay, to be covered in ivy. I can try and dig that out if we can make a note of who was asking those questions. Yeah. I'll try and get a bit more info on that. But generally, there's too much ivy from a lichen perspective in a lot of places. I mean, a lot of woods in England are just covered in this stuff. I'll probably get in trouble for saying that.
No, not at all. Thanks, Dave. I'll ask you an easy-ish one because we literally have only got a minute or two left. Somebody's asked if you can recommend a hand lens. Now, I think we can't do sort of brand names and things like that. But what should people be thinking about looking for if they're thinking about getting a decent hand lens?
Spend as much money as you can. It's like binoculars. You get more for your money, kind of thing. I think metal, good glass lenses, not plastic lenses. And if you can get one with a light, and a way of illuminating, that makes a whole world of difference. Especially for those kind of tiny little species that like old oak trunks that grow in the crevices of oak bark. Having a light really helps you get to see those.
Great. I think we're going to have to call it that for now, Dave and Demelza. Again, thank you so much. I now have my favourite new named lichen, which is the shy cross your heart lichen. That's just wonderful. Again, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. We will try and answer as many of the questions that were made outside the webinars. We have a record of all of those. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you'll join some of our other Plant Life Spring into Action webinars that are still to come over the next week or so. Again, thank you very, very much, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone.